Hello, good day to one and all. This is Miss A. Krishna Sundar, Assistant Professor, Department of English, KAHM Unity Women's College, Manjeri. Today we would be discussing the essay written by E.V. Lucas, which is titled as Bows. Now, this is the second part of the essay. We had already discussed the first part, in which paragraphs ranging from 1 to 6 have been analyzed. So here we start from paragraph number 7 till 10, as we have already discussed. The initial 6 paragraphs, they describe the characteristics of boring people, because throughout the essay we see E.V. Lucas is trying to speak about the general qualities of a boring person. So we are moving on to paragraph 7, because in the previous paragraph, that is in paragraph 6, E.V. Lucas has already discussed that crafty people will not be boring people because they are very clever and they never can be boring. And the second thing, busy people too would not be boring people. So he's actually categorizing the different qualities that you can see in bows, and he's also distinguishing how a boring person can be different from another kind of category of human beings. Now moving on to paragraph number 7. From this paragraph onwards, E.V. Lucas is talking about the different kinds of boring people. In general, though we call them boring people, there are minor categories even among boring people, and that category is what he talks about in this paragraph. Of all bows, the most repellent specimen is the one who comes close up. So the most repellent specimen means the most irritating kind of bows. These are the people who will be coming and standing to you very close. The buttonholing bow. The buttonholing. Now the term has got a specific meaning. Buttonholing means someone who will detain you with a conversation in which you are not really interested to participate. So in a way, forcibly, you are detained by the other person with certain stories which might not be of any interest to you. So those kind of people are known as buttonholing bow, which means they would forcibly make you listen to their boring stories, because you won't get a chance to move away from these kind of people. This is a kind described by a friend of mine with a vivid sense of phrase. Vivid means very, very clear. The opposite of vivid is vague. So vague means something which is not clear. Vivid means something which is very clear. So a clear sense of phrase as the man who spreads bird lime all over you. So this is how a buttonholing bow can be described. A buttonholing bow can be described as a man who spreads bird lime all over you. So what is that comparison? Now, what is bird lime? To understand this comparison, you should know what bird lime is. Now, you can see again in the red column, the third red column, bird lime is actually a sticky liquid which is used to trap birds. So, this liquid will be spread on top of the branches so that when birds come and sit on top of these branches, they get glued or they get stuck to this liquid, which means once they get stuck to this liquid, they cannot move away from this. So these buttonholing bows are just like that, because once they catch you into their circle, there is no other way left for you to move away from them. A bow who keeps a reasonable way off can be dealt with, which means a boring poor person who keeps a distance from you can be dealt with, but when they lean on you, you are done. When they come and stand very, very close to you and start narrating their stories, you are totally done, which means you are finished because you don't have another option to run away from these kind of people. It is worst when they fix your eyes only a foot away. So imagine 1 foot away means they would be standing very close to you and tell you a funny story that isn't funny. So this is a climax because they would be telling you a funny story, and sometimes you might have seen people who would talk and laugh. The listeners might not be listening to them, the listeners might not be laughing, but these people will narrate their own stories and they would laugh with their own stories. So, this is how it happens. They tell you a funny story, but that story isn't really funny for you. Nothing is so humiliating as to have to counterfeit laughter at the bidding of a bow, but we do it. Counterfeit, I'm sure you might have heard about the term like counterfeit notes, which means fake notes. So here, counterfeit laughter means fake laughter. So here you are pretending laughter. You are not really interested in the conversation. You don't want to listen to their funny stories, but they keep laughing at their own stories that you don't have another choice. So even if you are totally disinterested with the topic, you have to laugh along with these boring people. The incurable weakness and benignancy of human nature once again. So E.V. Lucas is once again talking about the human quality, which is the kindness. Because it is because of the kindness in human beings that we still have the patience to tolerate these kind of boring people. So, the crux of this paragraph includes the worst of all bows would be those who snatch you deliberately for attention. So, that is a buttonholing kind of bow. And you will have to pretend that you are listening. So, there is no other option left for you. So, moving on to the next stanza. Then there is a beau who begins a funny story. So, this is another category. And although you tell him you have heard it, doesn't stop. So this is the most irritating one, I feel, because you might have listened to the story for innumerable times, and the moment the other person starts the story, you remind him, oh, this is a story which you have told me, or this is a story which I have heard. But that won't shake the other person. He would not stop and he would continue telling the story again. What should be done with him? So there is no option to deal these kind of people. Another of the worst types of beau is a man who says, where should we be without our sense of humor? Which means this boring person would be talking a lot about sense of humor, but in his talks, this sense of humor might not be reflected. He is even capable of saying, nothing but my unfailing sense of humor saved me. So this is very contradictory because on one side, the boring person would be saying that he is a very humorous person, but on the other hand, his stories would be boring you much. There is also the man who says, live and let live, as my poor dear father used to say. So, live and let live means you are giving a space for the other person to run away from you. But what actually happens here is that these boring people will not allow you to run away from them. They keep you detained with their boring stories. So, actually, live and let live is not happening. They are not letting others live. They are actually killing others with their boring stories. Moving on to the next stanza. So this is actually the penultimate paragraph, the one which is just before the final paragraph of the essay. So this is again an anecdote, a kind of experience, a kind of story that he relates to emphasize the points. There was once an eccentric peer. So peer is someone who's of the same age or the same group. I forget both his name and the place where I read about him, who had contracted, all unconsciously, the habit of thinking out loud. So now he's talking about a friend or maybe an acquaintance, and he calls that person as eccentric. Now, who's an eccentric? An eccentric is a person who's having some kind of variations in nature. Maybe they do very contradictory or opposite kind of things. You call that kind of a person a little bit eccentric. So he says this friend of E.V. Lucas, he was an eccentric peer. And why is he called as an eccentric? The story is narrated here. He has the habit of thinking out loud. What is thinking out loud? Do we think out loud? All of us are having different thoughts in our minds, right? We have a number of thoughts crossing our mind every minute, every second. But do we speak about all these thoughts openly aloud? We don't do that, right? Sometimes even when you sit in a classroom, you would be having so many things running through your mind, but you keep quiet, you listen to the lecture. Sometimes, even if you are not listening to the lecture, what do you do in a classroom? You pretend that you are listening to the lecture and then you think in your own ways, right? So, whatever you think, you will not openly speak about that. But this person had the habit of thinking out loud, which means there are some people who are very impulsive in nature. You might have seen whatever comes to their mind, they directly speak about it without thinking about the consequence. So usually the majority never do that. But there are some people who think loud, which means whatever comes to their mind, they will be openly speaking about it in the public group. And in this world of artifice, which means this world of artificiality, because everything is artificial today, where society is cemented and sustained very largely by a compromise between what we think and what we say, which means you will be having hundreds of thoughts in your mind. Will you speak about all those thoughts in public? No. You select and you say only what is required for the situation. The rest of the things will remain as thoughts. So it is actually a compromise in society between what we think and what we say. His thoughts were very often at a variance with his words, but in the case of this eccentric friend, he openly spoke about everything that came to his mind. And now E.V. Lucas is narrating another incident. One of the stories in the memoir is actually a story which is connected with the memory of a person, in which I found him describe how he met an acquaintance in St. James Street. So he's talking about an incident which happened at St. James Street, and after muttering means mumbling, you are saying something which is not very clear, quite audibly to himself for a few minutes as they walked side by side. So from St. James Street, this eccentric friend met a boring person. Okay? So his thoughts, which should have been remained in his own mind, is actually audible to all the other people around him, because this eccentric friend had the habit of thinking out loud. So what did he say? Confound it! What a nuisance meeting this fellow. I have always disliked him. So see, he is openly saying he has met a boring person from St. James Street, and he is openly saying confound it. So confound means a sudden surprise or things which happen in a way not in the expected way. You call that confound. So here something which happened as a surprise or a sudden kind of confusion, or maybe it can be in a positive way or it can be in a negative way, and especially not according to their own expectation. So suddenly this eccentric man, he finds the boring person from St. James Street, and he openly says, what a nuisance meeting this fellow. I have always disliked him. But now that we have met, I suppose I must ask him to dinner. So see the contradiction. Because he openly says that this is a boring person, I dislike this person. But at the same time, in the very next sentence, he is suggesting, since we have met, let us go together for dinner. He stopped and said with every appearance of cordiality, which means in a very hospitable way, in a very friendly way, you will dine with us this evening, won't you? So finally he is asking the boring person, will you dine with me tonight? So What he had thought in his mind and what he has actually done, they are completely contradictory. Well, as a sheet of armor plate against bows, I don't think we could do much better than cultivate the habit of thinking truthfully aloud. As a sheet of armor plate, now armor plate means armors are usually used in wars. So in war, an armor plate is used to get protection from the attacks of the enemies or the strangers who are participating in the war. So armor plate is actually considered as a shield, a protective layer. So this best armor plate against bows would be the habit of thinking truthfully aloud. So this is what E.V. Lucas is suggesting us. E.V. Lucas says that the best way to make the boring people understand that they are bores would be to think truthfully aloud, which means whatever comes to your mind, don't keep it in your mind, just openly speak about it to the boring people so that they would understand that you are not interested in their stories. Unless we can do this, or train ourselves to be downright offensive. So, in a way, this is really offensive, right? Because if someone is approaching you and you suddenly tell him, oh, you are a boring person, I don't want to spend my time with you, it really is an offending kind of statement, but you can't help it because this is the only possible way to move away from these kind of boring people. And he says there is no remedy against bores except total evasion. So there are two options for you. Either you should tell them directly you are not interested to listen to them, else the second option would be total evasion. To evade means to avoid a person completely. No beau ever says, after no matter how many hints, I will avoid that man in future, I know I beau him. So he says that bows have got another quality, and that quality is that they can never understand things from clues. Sometimes you understand the situation from clues or hints, right? In a general classroom, for example, being a teacher, when I look at the faces of my children in a classroom, when I see students looking at their watches continuously, I get the clue that it is time for me to stop. And sometimes I can see some students lying on the desk, some of them leaning towards the desk, some of them with a very boring face. So these are some of them would be looking out of the window. So these are all clues which makes you understand that you have to stop your lecture. So here he says that whatever clue you might be giving, a boring person can never realize that the other person is disinterested in his talks. So this is again another quality of bows. So moving on to the very last paragraph. So in conclusion, E.V. Lucas says they will always flourish, which means there is no end for these boring people. These boring people will continue in our societies. But if a certain famous weekly humorous paper were to cease publication means to stop publication, distasteful and incredible thought, he says. Now remember, he mentions a number of humorous weeklies and other journals in which he had been associated with, which we have gone through in the introduction. Now he says that if some of these papers or weeklies are stopped, sometimes there can be a cure for this boring people, because all these kind of boring conversation appear in these kind of papers. There would automatically be a decrease in both topics, because then no one could any longer repeat those sayings of his children which are good enough for punch. So he finally concludes by stating that if these kind of weekly humorous papers can cease the publication, definitely people will not have enough stories to circulate and to create boredom in other people. So he says as long as these kind of papers flourish, boring people too would flourish. Else, on the other side, if these kind of publications come to an end, in the same way, boring people too will not be able to thrive. So, boring articles will continue as long as we tolerate it. So, unless you find a solution for this, you will have to continue tolerating the boring people as well. So, with this, we come to the end of the second part of the essay. So, we have completed the entire essay. So, in the next session, we would be discussing the questions and answers related to the essay. So, thank you very much. Thanks a lot for your patient listening. In case of any queries or any suggestions, please do not hesitate to connect with me through my email ID. So, thank you very much. Thank you once again.